Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. In a rather comprehensive biography of Henrik Ibsen, Robert Ferguson attributes much of the thematic content within the noted Norwegian playwright's 25 theatrical works to a series of the dramatist's personally significant life events. According to Ferguson, Ibsen's plays generally dramatized an intensely personal battle, explaining that as a second child within an initially prosperous merchant family whose 2-year-old brother died just 3 weeks after he was born, there had also been a suspicion that infant Henrik had not actually been the child of his mother's husband, Canard Ibsen, but rather the offspring of an old flame of his mother, who Ferguson describes as a politician and poet named Thurman Knudsen, a piece of information which, as a young boy, Henrik is thought to have gleaned one night while overhearing an argument between his mother and otherwise assumed to be father sometime after Mr. Ibsen's business had failed and he'd become a chronically excessive drinker who'd borrowed heavily from creditors without having the means to repay his debts. Ferguson then describes Henrik Ibsen himself as having been an unsociable boy who preferred to shut himself away in a small room where he would amuse himself painting, drawing, or reading and playing with his toy theater. A next-door neighbor recalled him as an unpleasant lad who was really nasty, spiteful, and cruel, adding, "Nobody wanted to be with him. He was always on his own, and he was also disgracefully vain." At the age of 15, in 1844, young Henrik was apprenticed to an apothecary, and then, 2 years later, conceived a child with a servant in his employer's household who was 10 years older than himself, Elise Sophie Beckendalen, whose son, Hans Jacob Henriksen, Ibsen was legally ordered to support. Later in life, after his biological father had gained international fame, the illegitimate young man, Ferguson states, took to the road armed with his birth certificate and regularly introduced himself as an Ibsen in order to get people in taverns to buy him drinks. Beginning with the writing of humorous verse, in addition to expressing provocative views on religion, admiring the writing of Voltaire, and openly denying the existence of a personal God, Henrik Ibsen also secretly began to write serious poetry addressing the themes of a golden age of Nordic Viking expansion. A first play, titled Catalina, was published under a pseudonym in 1850, when its author was 22 years old, and Ibsen's first staged play, The Burial Mound, was produced later that same year without receiving much in the way of any critical recognition. Determined to be a playwright, during the next 5 years, Henrik Ibsen became active in the theater in the city of Kristiania, present-day Oslo, and worked on as many as 145 productions, in addition to writing 5 of his own scripts. Then, after having been challenged to a duel by the father of a young woman in whom he had shown some interest, presumably as a result of the man's awareness of the previous paternity suit, Henrik met and married Susanna Thorensen, who was 7 years younger than himself, in June of 1858. The same year his play, The Vikings at Helgeland, was produced. 6 months later, their son Sigurd was born. Apparently, due to a difficult delivery, Robert Ferguson states, Suzanne shocked her immediate circle by announcing that she would have no more children. Without any form of reliable birth control existing at the time, it's been generally assumed that this could only have been possible through the practice of abstinence and the establishment of a platonic and celibate relationship between husband and wife that seems to have been maintained for the next 46 years until Henrik Ibsen's death in 1906, after having suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1899 that left him totally in the physical care of his spouse and only acknowledged son. During a period of 41 years, largely thanks to the support and encouragement of his wife, Ibsen developed a significant writing career, eventually acquiring both worldwide popular acclaim and a large number of citation medals that he routinely wore in public, as well as a fairly substantial financial fortune. While accepting annual stipends from the government of Norway, Ibsen mostly lived and wrote in Italy and later Germany. And within the last 2 decades of his life, from around the age of 60, Robert Ferguson observes, Ibsen began a series of apparently unconsummated relationships with at least 5 different young women who ranged in age from 18 to 30, each of whom influenced the playwright's insights into female psychology in ways that have been thought to have directly contributed to the characters depicted within his work. As interesting and informative as these biographical speculations may, however, be, I would say it is generally true that virtually everyone experiences things during life that can be described as personally significant, and which deal with a vast number of important issues ranging from childhood trauma to adolescent entanglements, varying degrees of personal shyness disguised as arrogance in order to provide a sense of self-protection, alcoholism, and intimate adult compromises, as well as personal failures and possible levels of success. But very, very few people have ever been capable of transforming those kinds of things into the raw material of more than 24 full-length plays over a 50-year period of time, while, along the way, becoming generally acknowledged as the father of realism and, according to an extensive Wikipedia article, becoming the most frequently performed dramatist in the world after Shakespeare. Ibsen's most acclaimed works include An Enemy of the People, as adapted by Arthur Miller and used for a Warner Brothers motion picture produced by and starring Steve McQueen, with incidental music composed by Edvard Grieg for his Peer Gynt, and including the famous Hall of the Mountain King, although that's not a part of the orchestral suite that Grieg prepared subsequent to the play. And then A Doll's House, which was the world's most performed play in 2006, the centennial of its year of its author's death. Then there's Hedda Gabler, ghosts, the pillars of society, the wild duck, the master builder, lady from the sea, and when we dead awaken. In fact, regarding Henrik Ibsen's dramatic work, an article written by James Joyce in 1900, the author of Ulysses, the book that the Modern Library Association has acknowledged as having been the best novel of the 20th century, Joyce even asserted that Ibsen's plays, along the role of drama both ancient and modern, have seldom been succeeded as better theatrical experiences. The themes and issues which Ibsen used much of his autobiographical material to address range from explorations of the history and folklore of Scandinavia, and Norway in particular, to universal concerns regarding the overall human condition, utilitarianism, determinism, and even hypnotism. Ibsen addressed questions of uncompromising all-or-nothing religious fundamentalism in plays like Brand, gender inequality in A Doll's House, inherited physical disease in Ghosts, and then in other plays, suicide, substance dependency and its impact upon individual achievement, the conflict between empirical, science-based data and popular opinion driven by perceived short-term individual economic advantage, and finally, varying degrees of mysticism. A metaphor for the scope of Ibsen's work can perhaps be derived from the introductory commentary to a 1933 English translation of Peer Gynt. The action, which opens in the early years of the 19th century and ends in the late 60s, takes place partly in Gunbrandsdale and the mountain peaks surrounding it, and partly on the coast of Morocco, in the Sahara Desert, and an insane asylum at Cairo, and then at sea. For what is arguably Ibsen's most well-known play, A Doll's House, he drew the basic details from a specific experience of a female author who had been greatly influenced by his play Brand, named Laura Cuyler, and who, when her husband was diagnosed with tuberculosis, had secretly borrowed the money needed to take him to a warmer climate in order to recover, but then, become unable to repay her debt, attempted to pass some forged banknotes after Ibsen had declined to offer her a loan, and was involuntarily committed to an insane asylum by her husband before, ultimately, returning to live with him and their children. Within A Doll's House, however, Ibsen transformed these particular circumstances into what George Bernard Shaw described as a journey in search of self-respect that essentially represented the end of a chapter of human history when the play's central character, Nora, decides to leave her husband and 3 children, slamming the door closed behind her as she assertively goes from their home. Although the play has largely been acknowledged as a dramatic manifesto of feminism, Ibsen himself asserted that he had to disclaim the honor of having consciously worked for the women's rights movement. And yet, A Doll's House might still be described as anticipating the insights of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique whether intentionally or not, by as many as 84 years in its depiction of the movement towards Nora's realization that she, before anything else, had the responsibility to seek self-realization and fulfillment of her own individual identity in a way that sent palpable shock waves reverberating throughout 19th century Western civilization, both in Europe and America, and even forced its author to provide, largely against his will, an alternative happy ending in order to get the play produced at all in Germany. Following A Doll's House, Ibsen turned from individual striving to determine a personal future to the consequences of the behavior of others in the past as represented in Ghosts. Within this play, the results of a woman having remained within a loveless marriage rather than leaving it are examined as they impact her son with inherited venereal disease and ultimately result in euthanasia. The following year, Ibsen took on the issue of scientific truth in contrast to public opinion in The Enemy of the People, and then addressed the negative consequence of revealing personal truths in The Wild Duck, including the identity of a young woman's biological father, one character observing, "Deprive the average human being of his lifeline, and you rob him of his happiness." With regard to Ibsen's next play, expressing an interest in mysticism, Rosmersholm, according to an analysis by Sigmund Freud, someone who largely made a career of penetrating life lies in an effort to try and resolve psychological distress, the induced suicide of one character by another, named Rebecca, and then her subsequent inability to engage in the relationship for which she had caused the other woman to kill herself, was interpreted by Freud as being the result of an incestuous relationship with a man who it was suspected may well have been her biological father. In Hedda Gabler, it also seems that there is a stronger attraction for the title character to the image of her deceased father than either to her husband or the other man who had loved her and who she had once driven away with one of her dead father's matched set of dueling pistols years before, essentially destroying his life and the world-changing philosophical manuscript he had written, the play concluding in her suicide using one of her father's 2 guns and causing a potentially exploitive older man to simply observe, "People don't do such things." Next, in The Master Builder, generally described as an autobiographical work, an aging architect who has become concerned about the need for making room for the younger generation is unexpectedly encountered by a 22-year-old young woman who he had 10 years previously promised to return to when she had grown up like a troll in a Nordic folktale and make her his princess with a castle in the air. This apparently rejuvenating relationship finally leads to the older man's attempt, in spite of a marked fear of heights, to top out a newly constructed church spire with an evergreen wreath, only to fall to his death, the young girl excitedly exclaiming, "But he went straight to the top, and I heard harps in the air, my master builder." An awareness of the existence of an emerging rival generation, Robert Ferguson has suggested, might well be inferred from Ibsen's placement behind him, where he wrote in his study a portrait of the 21-year younger fellow Scandinavian dramatist August Strindberg. For Ibsen's final play in 1899, When We Dead Awaken, the concluding insight is one that I think resonates well beyond the context of the script itself and into a universal cautionary observation. What is past redemption? That's what we never see until we see that we have never lived. Well, let that be a lesson to you when you think about spending more time in your workplace and putting off that dream vacation for yet another year. Ars longa vita brevis. Art is long, life is brief. It's been 124 years since Ibsen penned his version of that aphorism attributed to Hippocrates and repeated in Latin by the Roman Stoic philosopher, statesman, and dramatist Seneca. Perhaps Henrik Ibsen's work truly bears out that adage, advancing ideas which continue to reverberate in the minds of the people reading, producing, enacting, and watching performances of his plays. In a 1917 introduction to a translation of Ibsen's drama, however, the American journalist, essayist, and satirist H.L. Mencken asserted that from end to end of his life, there is no record that Ibsen ever wrote a single word or formulated a single idea that might not have been exposed in a newspaper editorial. What Mencken claims instead is that Ibsen was under no delusions about his drama of ideas. He was a hard-working dramatist and man of sense, and he never forgot for an instant that he was writing not tracts, but stage plays. Mencken points out in his discussion of the playwright that he once said, "What I wanted to do was to depict human beings, human emotions, and human destinies upon a groundwork of certain social conditions and principles from the time within which he lived." The paradox, of course, is that it is possibly represented by most of the writers what is generally acknowledged to be literature, which is that the royal road, borrowing a phrase from Freud, to relevance and universal significance is and remains deeply personal subjectivity. The human story is everyone's story, but only a very few human beings have the discipline and the hard-gained ability to effectively tell it. Henrik Ibsen, it seems, was one of those individuals who did have the ability to transcend the circumstances of his biography and use its specifics to raise the curtain upon consistently reoccurring themes within the experience of being human. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.